Hello everyone. First of all, I would like to thank you all for being here listening to our presentation, which is entitled The Role of Referential, Iconic and Non-Referential Speech Gestures in Children's Narrative Production, Iconic Signal and Cunning Changes in Speech. So this study has been done in collaboration with Dr. Demir-Lira and with Dr. Pilar Prieto, who was my thesis advisor. First of all, I would like to mention that previous literature has shown that children's gestures are integral to their communication and thought, and thus are tightly linked to language acquisition and learning, and pave the way for language development. But if we go farther in development, we also see that these gestures are also related to children's more complex linguistic skills, such as narrative abilities. Importantly, oral narrative discourse abilities function as an ecologically valid measure of a child's linguistic development and academic performance. However, does its development rely on children's gestures? So we all know that when narrating a story, we use all different kinds of spontaneous gestures. So these gestures are meaningfully integrated from a semantic, pragmatic, and temporal point of view. So here we adapted McNeil's classification of gestures, and we have referential gestures, which visually depict the semantic content of the speech. So we have iconic gestures and metaphoric gestures and deictic gestures. And then we have non-referential gestures that are beat gestures. And these type of gestures are rhythmic hand movements that do not reflect contextual meaning of the spoken message, but are typically associated with prominent prosodic positions in a speech. So gestures are not only precursors, but can also predict the oncoming changes in speech. Previous studies have shown that iconics emerge at around 26 months of age, and that referential gestures predict vocabulary growth and syntactic skills. Beat gestures are the last gestures to emerge ontogenetically, as they appear at around 24-42 months of age. This study by Nicolades and colleagues found a link between beat gestures and iconics and more linguistically complex spoken utterances. And what is the role of these gestures in narrative development? So iconic gestures and beat gestures follow distinct trajectories in language, and iconics are acquired in complex discourses before than beats, as they appear at around 4 and 5 years of age. While it is not until children are 5 to 6 years old to even 10 years old that they use these type of gestures in complex discourses. So previous studies has focused on this relevance of iconic gestures in learning processes and specifically in narrative development. So the first study showed that at 5 years, children use character viewpoint gestures, in which the gesturer takes on the role of the character to introduce new characters before doing so in a speech. The second study found that training children in producing this type of gestures enhance their narrative scores after training. And finally, this last study found that 5-year-old children who express character viewpoint by gestures in narrative production improve their narrative structure in speech across ages. However, it is important to mention that these studies have just focused on these character viewpoint gestures. But less is known about beat gestures. And we know that asking 5 to 6-year-old children to observe and encouraging them to produce beats in a narrative training task improve the quality of their narrative performance. And that children's early use of beats at 14 to 58 months of age in parent-child interactions predict better structured narratives at 5 years. However, further research is needed to investigate this link between children's use of referential iconics, not only character viewpoint gestures, in comparison with non-referential beat gestures performing narrative speech, and also to assess their predictive value in later narrative production. So the main research question of our study is whether referential iconic and or non-referential beat gestures performed by 5 to 6-year-old children in their narratives can signal changes in later narrative performance 2 years later. Our hypothesis is that both types of gestures will contribute to these later narrative productions. On the one hand, we think that iconics will provide an additional layer of information, and on the other hand, we think that beat gestures will serve important pragmatic discourse functions in a speech. So in order to carry out this study, we had 83 Catalan-dominant children from the Girona area of Catalonia, and these children are part of Vilà-Giménez and colleagues' corpus of Catalan children's narrative development, and were recorded twice. At time 1, when they were 5 to 6 years of age, and at time 2, when they were 7 to 9 years of age. So children were administered a narrative retelling task with 2 wordless cartoons, randomly selected from these 4 wordless cartoons, and same wordless cartoons were shown both at time 1 and at time 2. So we finally got 332 video recorded stories. As for the coding system, narratives performed at time 1 were coded for gesture type, referential, iconic, and non-referential beat gestures, and narratives performed at time 2 were scored for narrative structure. So here we use a rubric from 0 to 6. Now you can watch an example of a narrative of a wordless cartoon recorded at time 1. So this girl got the score of 3. She performed 5 iconics and 3 beats.
Una guineu tenia un elefant, havia trobat un arbre però sense fulles, de tubos, sense fulles, eren de tubos i l'elefant ha pujat allà i s'ha destrossat. Després ho han construït, però igual no, i tenien una caixa amb roures i li han passat, que han anat passant.
Wow.
Per baix, per dalt i...
Que xulo.
And here you can watch the same girl performing the same narrative of the same wordless cartoon, but at time 2. So here she got the maximum score of 6.
Era un ratolí que portava com un cistell, com una caixa però amb rodes, i portava un elefant. I van anar a veure una estàtua que era com un arbre, que estava fet de tubos, i l'elefant ho va tocar amb la trompa i es va destrossar. I el ratolí va tenir una idea i va fer una atracció, va fer una muntanya russa. Després s'hi van ficar els dos i van com passar per la muntanya russa que havien construït ells.
Molt bé.
As for the results, we ran a linear stepwise regression analysis, and we found that iconic gestures produced in narrative speech by 5 to 6-year-old children predict these children's later narrative structure scores. However, we did not find this predictive value for beats. The main conclusion of this study is that referential iconic gestures that accompany narratives produced by 5 to 6-year-old children were predictors of better structured narratives at later ages. All kinds of iconics predict changes in narrative speech, not only character viewpoint gestures. And we also found a higher number of iconic gestures, which we think that they were triggered by the narrative retelling task. However, we think that further analysis should be done in order to analyze the role of gesture viewpoint. And finally, we would like to mention that we got different results for beats performing naturalistic interactions, as they did predict children's later narrative performance. However, beats performing narratives, as in this study, were not found to be predictors of children's later narrative performance. The take-home message of this study is that embodied narrative retellings using body movements can be an important experience for children, and gesture types can contribute differently to narrative production. So thank you to my collaborators, to schools, children, and families, and thank you all for your attention.